Kierkegaard says that an individual is in despair if he does not align himself with God or God's plan for the self. This, according to psychology, would refer to the state of alienation in which the ego is totally disconnected from the self. The connection between ego and self is vitally important to psychic health. It gives foundation, structure, and security to the ego and also provides energy, interest, meaning, and purpose. When the connection is broken, the result is emptiness, despair, meaninglessness, and in extreme cases, psychosis or suicide. Genesis gives us the story of Cain and Abel. It tells us that Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen?" Here, Yahweh does not seem to realize that it was his own rejection of Cain and his offering that has caused the whole trouble. After this rejection from Yahweh, Cain took his brother Abel to the field and killed him. And when Yahweh found out what Cain did, he banished Cain to the wilderness. Now, if we look at this myth objectively rather than traditionally, we see that the origin of the difficulty was God's rejection of Cain without apparent cause or reason. And this rejection led him to violence, because whenever one experiences an unbearable alienation or despair, it is followed by violence. From the standpoint of our inner psyche, there is very little difference between murder and suicide. The only difference is in the direction in which the destructive energy is flowing, which is primarily caused by the alienation and which ultimately leads to despair. Now, according to depth psychology, alienation is not a dead end. Hopefully, it can lead to a greater awareness of the heights and depths of life. Just as the experience of active inflation is a necessary accompaniment of ego development, so the experience of alienation is a necessary prelude to awareness of the self. The self, in its effort at self-realization, reaches out beyond the ego personality on all sides. Because of its all-encompassing nature, it is brighter and darker than the ego, and accordingly confronts the ego with problems which it would like to avoid. Either one's moral courage fails, or one's insight, or both, until in the end fate decides. From this, we can see the numinous power of the self, which can hardly be experienced in any other way. For this reason, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. There are numerous descriptions of religious experiences which typically are preceded by what Saint John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, and what Kierkegaard called despair, and what Jung calls defeat of the ego. All these terms refer to the same psychological state of alienation. Psychologically, this means that the experience of the archetypal self is most likely to occur when the ego has exhausted its own energy and is aware of its helplessness nature. In other words, when the ego realizes that there is something else infinitely more powerful than itself. But it is impossible for the ego to experience the self as something separate, as long as the ego is unconsciously identified with the self. This explains the need for the alienation experience as a prelude to the religious experience. The ego must first be disidentified from the self before the self can encounter as the other. As long as one is unconsciously identified with God, he cannot experience his existence. The process of ego self-separation causes alienation because loss of ego self-identity also involves damage to the ego self-axis. Hence, the typical dark night of the soul that precedes the numinous experience. The ego cannot experience the support of the self until it has been freed of its identification with self. It cannot be a vessel for the influx of self's energy until it has been emptied of its own inflated fullness. And this emptying occurs only through the experience of alienation. And so the state of alienation or despair is an archetypal experience for mankind. Martin Luther expresses the same idea. He says, God works by contraries so that a man feels himself to be lost in the very moment when he is on the point of being saved. When God is about to justify a man, he damns him. Whom he would make alive, he must first kill. God's favor is so communicated in the form of wrath that it seems furtive when it is at hand. Man must first cry out that there is no health in him. He must be consumed with horror. This is the pain of purgatory. In this disturbance, salvation begins. When a man believes himself to be utterly lost, light breaks in.